Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I did a video a couple years ago called The Most Common Opening Inaccuracies, so we're not going to duplicate that, but we might cover a little of the same ground. I thought I'd just go over some of the stuff I see people not understanding about the opening, maybe some common ideas. So let's just kind of fool around with some common openings and look at what some of the things that you should know if your opponent's not really a strong player and what you might do about it. So let's for the sake of argument, let's talk about the first couple moves of the game. The general idea in e-pawn openings is to play d4 if you can do it safely, and the general idea in d4 openings is to play e4 if you can do it safely. If you think of that in almost every opening that you're playing with e4 or d4, it helps you kind of figure out what the main ideas are. For instance, obviously, if you play d4 and someone plays a6 and you're a d4, c4 player, there's nothing wrong with playing c4 here. It's a perfectly good move, but you could also now switch and play e4. Same thing, if white plays e4, then there's a few black moves, 6 of them, that prevent d4 as being the best move. The 6 are e5, when d4 pawn takes. If you try to get it back, he can win a tempo with the knight. c5, the Sicilian, for the same reason. d5, which stops d4 because it attacks your e-pawn. f5, for the same reason. If you play d4, you lose the e-pawn. So therefore, after e4, f5, you should just take it off the board. Knight f6, which attacks the e-pawn again, and when you play d4, he can play knight takes e4. And finally, b5, when instead of playing d4, you can just win a pawn with bishop takes b5. If he doesn't play one of those 6 moves after e4, then the most common move is to play d4. Now, a lot of beginners, they learn e4, e5, knight f3, and then no matter what their opponent does, whether they play a French or something, they play knight f3, which isn't a terrible move, but it's not the idea. You don't need the knight on f3 right now anymore. You could just play d4 right away, which is the main line of the French. Now let's see what happens if your opponent doesn't try to do much of anything. Suppose he plays the modern defense, and you play d4, and now he plays like a6. Well, a lot of beginners here like to play like knight f3, b6, knight c3, bishop b7, bishop c4, d6, castle, bishop g7, and then they'll play something like, I don't know, bishop f4. Well, there's nothing wrong with this. I'm sure Stockfish is going to tell us that white's better here. Mr. Stockfish, what's the evaluation? Stockfish says, oh yes, Dan, you're right. White's better, maybe by 0.7. But one of the things you can do when your opponent's not doing anything to fight for the center is if he's playing silly moves, like g6 is not silly, but if he plays like a6, that's pretty silly. You can also start putting more pawns in the center instead of putting your knights there. So let's ask Stockfish what his top 3-4 moves are here. Stockfish, here we go. Let's turn on Stockfish 15. Okay, and we can see here that Stockfish's number 1 move is not to bring out a knight. It's to bring out another pawn toward the middle with c4. Now he's considering maybe bishop c4. But the point is, when your opponent is playing these moves where he's not really fighting for the center, it makes some sense to keep grabbing more space. Like, look here, f4, number 1 or number 2 move here. f4 is a very reasonable idea in this kind of position. And if he keeps doing nothing, now you can bring out your knights behind the pawns. Now knight c3 makes a lot more sense. Now if he plays like queen c7, now playing knight f3 behind your f-pawn makes sense because he's not doing anything, so you can use all these pawns to get space. You're always trying to do stuff like this if your opponent isn't stopping you. You don't want to just kind of blindly say, well, no matter how badly he's playing, I'm just going to bring out my knight, and then I'll just bring out my bishop. Look at the evaluation here. Even though black's played these 2 silly moves, because white has put his bishop where it's vulnerable and can be attacked with something worth less, AWL, with d5, already the engine says that white's advantage is very close to 0 here. So you want to kind of punish him. You want to get these pawns out here. You could see playing bishop c4 is about equal, while playing d4 is a big advantage. Another thing I see people do wrong a lot is when they play e4 and people play like the Philidor defense because they don't know anything, then the problem is this knight has kind of been nullified and there's no pressure really in the center. So they play reasonable moves like knight to c3 or bishop c4. But the move that's much more to the point is to play d4 and pressure the e-pawn immediately so that black has to figure out how to save it. In fact, if you watched one of the most famous games in history, Morphy against the Duke of Brunswick, Count Isouard, then the famous opera game, they played the bad move bishop g4, and Morphy said, oh, but if I can unpin the queen, I'm going to win this pawn. And he took the pawn, and now they were afraid to take back because Morphy would trade queens and take the pawn. So they took here, giving Morphy the bishop pair. Morphy then threatened mate, and when they stopped it, Morphy double attacked them on f7 and b7, and already he's winning a pawn. It's not that when you play moves like bishop c4 that's a problem. It's not a problem. And now let's talk about something that black does wrong. I think I talked about this in an earlier video. A lot of players, when I see them get to this position, they get so burned with knight f6, knight g5 hitting this pawn, and they don't know how to defend it, that they solve their problem by playing the terrible move h6. Well, the better way to solve that problem is simply bring the bishop out first. It's the only place it can go anyway. And now knight g5 is crazy. And if white castles, you can play knight f6, and now knight g5 is a bad move because you can castle. But I see people play h6 in this position all the time. They said, oh, when I was a beginner, I got burned by this. So the way to fix that before I bring out the knight is to play h6. Well, if they play h6, of course, you should just break in the center with d4. How much of an advantage do you think white has here? A normal white advantage is about 0.2. Let's take a look here. Mr. Stockfish, what's the evaluation now? Stockfish 15 says white is ahead by about 0.8. So white's advantage is close to even winning already. Talk about things you should know in the opening. Well, a famous common mistake you see is e4. I saw this at our chess club last night, believe it or not. Somebody played the common mistake, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, two knights defense, and instead of playing knight g5, or even the grandmaster move d3, they played knight c3, very natural move. But black actually knew this. Black had played against this enough times that he knew what to do. The reason why knight c3 is inaccurate, and you should know this, is knight takes e4. If you then take the knight, he uses the center fork trick to equalize. And if he plays bishop takes, pawn check, king takes, knight takes, then after d5, knight g5 check, king g8, black even has a bigger advantage because this knight is misplaced. Black has the bishop pair, black has a big center. Black will later play something like h6 and king h7 and get his bishop out and get the rook out, and black has a big, big advantage here. Let's ask Stockfish how much of an advantage. Stockfish, how much is black leading by here? 2.4, 2.5. That's basically just the game is over if both sides play perfectly. So again, you don't want to do stuff like that. What's another common error we talked about in many cases? Well, let's talk about center counter game. In center counter game, the main way to save your e-pawn is to take his pawn, and if he takes with the queen, you AWL him. You attack it with a knight and hit the queen, and we call that winning a tempo because you're developing a piece and you're forcing the queen to move again, and that means black has to use a tempo to save the queen, and he doesn't really want to do that, so he's losing a tempo here. White gets a tempo for development, black loses the tempo with the queen. But then when I see people get the exact same kind of idea with c4, when the only main lines for black are e6, queen's gambit declines, c6 Slav, d takes c4, queen's gambit accepted, and there's rarer lines like, I think that's the Chigorin defense, we've got the Alban counter gambit. But you see people mix up their Indian and queen's gambit defenses with knight f6. I see this all the time. I have these talks with my students. They see this position, and I just saw a game with this, and one of my students was white. He was playing another one of my students, and instead of doing the refutation, he did what a lot of weak players do here. They don't recognize why black's having a mistake here, and they play like knight c6. Well, this is a really bad move because it lets black transpose into a perfectly normal opening. Instead, you should recognize this AWL idea again. Play pawn takes pawn. And if they take with the queen, you can attack with a knight. Well, but then they say, but what if he takes with a knight? But you have a similar AWL now with e4. Now, the idea of e4 is the right idea, and e4 is a strong move here. But as they taught me many years ago, there's actually a better move, which is to delay e4 for one move and stop them from playing a later e5 and play knight f3 first, threatening to play e4. And that is a big advantage to white. If black does nothing and he plays like e6, you play e4. Big advantage to white. I show this to people all the time, and I don't know if they just have the bad board vision and they forget it, or they get caught up in the heat of the game, but they don't recognize this pattern as being really bad. They should take the pawn and attack it. Now you might say, but that's similar to the Grunfeld, Dan. In the Grunfeld, which is a major opening, black plays g6, white plays knight c3, and now black plays d5, and when white takes, black takes, and if you attack him with a pawn, he just takes, and this is a major opening for black. Yes, it is, and if you ask the engine, you'll see the Grunfeld, he has white better. Let's see how much better he has white here. Only about 0.4 for white in this position, even though he has a big center, because black's knight wasn't being chased around the board. He got to make a capture, and white had to recapture, even though it gave him an extra pawn in the middle. And white's advantage here, now that he's looking a little deeper, is around a third of a pawn. But if white plays d4, d5, c4, knight f6, pawn takes, knight f3, even if black plays that same move g6 and white plays e4, and black plays his best move, knight b6, look at that advantage for white now. It's not 0.3, it's all close to 1.3. It's about 1.2 right now. So this is a major difference from the Grunfeld. In the Grunfeld, white's advantage isn't nearly this big, because black has to waste time having the knight chased around the board instead of trading it for the white knight. So this position is far worse for black than, far worse for black than the Grunfeld would be. All right, so let's talk about some more common ideas we see in openings. What else do we see that takes place all the time? Well, okay, we saw, let's see a game from the black side that one of my students played recently. So he played the French and d5, and now, white didn't play d4. White played the King's Indian attack, played knight d2, and now my student correctly played c5, good move. White played knight f3, he played knight c6, and now g3. And now in this position, what do you think the main book move is? The main book move is to continue to develop your pieces, get ready to castle, and you should play knight f6. Now, are you worried about e5? Well, you should be worried about e5 if it drives your knight to a bad square. But if it drives your knight to a perfectly good square, there's nothing to worry about. It takes him one tempo to attack the knight. It takes you one tempo to guard it, but now you're attacking this knight twice. And notice he can never guard it with the pawn because you can just remove the guard, and on the next move you can take this pawn. So if white tries queen e2, we can play queen c7, and now black's attacking the pawn 3 times, and white's only guarding it twice, and again he can't play d4, you just take it with the pawn, and he's losing a pawn, so therefore e5 is just a bad move. So my student was afraid of knight f6 because of e5, but actually he was afraid of a bad move. So he played instead the very strange move b5. Well, b5 would make some sense if, the center was all locked up and you were trying to attack on the queen side. But here, the center is fluid, and that's the difference. When the center is fluid and you're just pushing all these pawns and not developing your pieces, your opponent can just get ready to attack you. For instance, white could play bishop g2, and if you keep moving your pawns here and castle and keep pushing pawns and not developing your pieces, he'll just play pawn takes pawn, rook checks, and all of a sudden your king's in trouble. If we ask the engine what's the evaluation here, it's already about plus 1.6, enough to win a game again. It takes about 1.0 to win the game. That's not what happened in the game, but let's show you what did happen. After b5, white did play bishop g7, and now black was starting to get afraid of white opening up the center, so he decided to lock it, but that takes more time and moves the pawn twice and takes the pressure off the center. And after white castled, black played e5, and black said, oh look, I've got all this space in the center. And you might say, well, superficially this looks really good for black. The problem is black's king's in the middle, his pawns have been pushed up to the detriment of his development, and now white, who was a much higher rated player, played a really good move. He plays a4, which is a good pattern to learn. The general rule on a4 is it works really well if that rook is not guarded. And you say, what? What's that rook not being guarded got anything to do with it? Well, it has to do with the fact that if black tries to maintain his pawn chain with a6, white just takes, and because of the sneaky pin, he can't take back because he loses the rook. So when the rook's not guarded, you can't play a6. But if you can't play a6, what can you do? Well, if you play b4 and you go, oh good, more space, well actually you're really weak on the white squares now, and you've wasted a lot of time, and white will just put his knight into here and attack this pawn again. And then later he'll get ready to play his break move, f5. And again, let's ask the engine what the evaluation is here. Stockfish says white's ahead, not by as much as before when black was really doing bad things, but white's ahead by much, much more than the average advantage, about 0.7. Okay, but what else could black do? Well, if he takes the pawn, that allows the knight to go here eventually anyway. He could go here right away, and if black stops to save this pawn, he could just take over here. And now black has an isolated a pawn on a semi-open file, and this rook has been activated, and white's just much, much better here. Mr. Stockfish, how much better? Oh, Stockfish says about +1 in this position. So taking the pawn is not so good. Pushing the pawn is not so good. But he's threatening to win the pawn. How do you save it? If you play rook to b8, again, I'm sure he'll just take the pawn. When you take here, the knight has this nice square. The rook has the semi-open file to attack this pawn. Stockfish says after knight c4, black is losing by almost 2 pawns. So again, good stuff here. In the game, black tried to guard the pawn with queen a5 to pin the pawn to the rook, and white, who was a fairly decent player, played this wonderful combination. A takes b, queen takes a1, b takes c6. And you might say, but Reinfeld values say a rook is worth 5 and knight's only worth 3 and a pawn's worth 1. Black has just won 5 and white only won 4, so black's up by 1. Well, unfortunately, those Reinfeld values, the 1, 3, 3, 5, 9 kind of stuff, are very good for general things, but in specific situations, very often they fail you. And here, black's threatening to play knight takes e5. And there's pretty much no defense. For instance, bishop d6 loses to knight to c4. Hitting the bishop and hitting the pawn. He can't save the bishop and save the pawn. If he plays f6, white actually has a sacrificial attack with queen check. You can't play g6 because queen takes e5 wins the rook. But if you start running your king around the board, king e7, white could just play queen takes check instead. Knight here. Stockfish says white's ahead by 9 pawns already in this position where king is stuck in the middle. The bishop's coming into the attack with check to win the rook. That's the threat. Just all kinds of terrible things are happening. So this was a very nice combination by white, and even though black has a rook for a knight and a pawn, the engine says white is up by 5 pawns here if black plays perfectly. So that was a very, very nice refutation by white. He played a4. The best black could have done, according to the engine, is to play b4, and now he's wasted all this time on these pawn moves, given the knight these wonderful squares, and white has a much, much bigger than normal advantage here. Okay, we got a few more minutes. Let's do some more talking here. let's talk about d4. So when you play d4, we said earlier in the video, if black does nothing, you could play c4, but you should probably just grab the center with e4 and switch to what could be an e-pawn opening. Suppose black does stop you from playing e4. What are the two main ways to do that? Well, one way is the Indian way, to play knight f6. We can make the board bigger and turn off the engine for a minute. We can play knight f6, and then white usually plays c4, so we can develop the knight behind the pawn. If he puts the knight in front of the pawn, you don't want to generally do that. You don't want to put your pieces in front of your break moves. Well, you might say this is not there's no break move here. The c-pawn is not a break move. But if black plays his best move here, which is d5, to stop white from playing e4, now c4 would be a break move, and the knight's in front of it, and that doesn't work. Similarly, we see this a lot where if white plays e4 and black plays e5 and white plays knight f3, black plays knight c6 to guard the pawn. And now the major ideas are to play the Scotch, where the best way to save the pawn is to take it, or to play the Italian game, where Gioco Piano is probably the easiest one to play, or play the Roy Lopez, where the old a6 Morphy move is the most common, but the modern line of playing the knight f6 right away is the Berlin defense, perfectly good and popular these days. But what you see sometimes is when white plays d4 and black plays d5, sometimes white plays the second most popular move, which is knight f3. And all these black players are used to e4, e5 when they're black and they're playing knight c6 here. They figure after d4, d5, knight f3, the move must be knight c6. Well, it's not. Do you know why? It's not the same thing at all, because in these double d-pawn openings, the break moves are e5 and c5 and c4 and e4. And black is blocking his break move with his knight. So this is not at all the same thing. And every time someone plays this and shows me a game where they did this for black, I say, let me guess, you got a cramped position. And usually they say, how did you know? It's only 2 moves into the game. And I say, well, when you block your break move like that, it's going to be hard to get getting space for your pieces, because the idea of playing e5 here is difficult because white's got 2 pieces on it and you've only got 1, and it's hard to get a second piece on that to break open. So if we ask the engine in this position after knight f3, what are the top 5 moves? Let's see if knight c6 makes the list. Mr. Engine, there's your top 5. Okay, so number 1 is c6, offering to go into a Slav on c4. It's jumping around, of course. Knight f6 here, which is completely okay because the pawn's not on c4. There's no AWL move that white can play, so knight f6 is good. e6, just getting ready to play a queen's gambit and play c5 break move is good. The crazy move knight d7, which does not block the break move and gets ready for the break move, with c5 actually makes the top 5. And you could even play your break move right away with c5. That makes the top 5 as well. But this move knight c6 doesn't make the top 5. Would it make the top 10? It probably makes the top 10, maybe. Mr. Stockfish, does it make the top 10? Wow, look at that. Knight c6 right now. Oh, it came back on the top 10 for a second there. It wasn't in the top. Oh, now it's all the way up to number, well, dropped down to 10 and went right off the list there. All right, so right now the top 10 does not include knight to c6. So that tells you if it's not in the top 10, it may not be a terrible move, doesn't lose the game or lose any material, but it's anti-positional here. So when you're blocking your break moves like that, you got a problem. So when you see positions like this, the general principle is try not to block your break moves with your pieces, and then you're okay. Now you might say, but what about the exchange French? e4, e5, d4, d5, pawn takes. Is it okay to put a knight in front of your c-pawns here because here's those double d-pawns again? Well, the answer is a lot of times you don't. You play a nice solid move like, you know, maybe something like, I'm just going in a line, knight here, then pawn here, queen here. You know, you could put a pawn there instead in a symmetric line like this in the exchange French. Why is this a little different? Well, it's different because now there's an open line for both sides. Both sides have an open file, and they can put the rooks there. They can trade rooks. There's a lot of open lines for the bishops. So here, it's not only less important to play a break move, but if you do play a break move, let's say white just takes it, that isolates your pawn here right in the middle on a semi-open file where he can attack it for the rest of the middle game. So playing c5 is not only not called for, but it may actually be somewhat detrimental. Is it completely ridiculous? No, of course not. You can play things like that. But in a position like the advanced French, where the center is completely locked, now c5 is the number one absolutely have to play move, and blocking it with your knight is like crazy. But if we have a completely different position with an open center, now putting the knight in front of the pawns is not so crazy at all. It may not be the best move, but it's not a bad move. And even though you're blocking a break move, you don't need a break move here. You need break moves when there's no open lines or no open or semi-open files. Here there's an open file right in the middle of the board. And look at the bishops. They all have tremendous scope here. They really don't need anything to help them break out. Look at all those nice lines on the board. Okay, so today we've just talked about some beginner concepts and openings. I know if you're rated over 1800, you're going to say, boy, that video, I know almost everything on that video. That's okay. A lot of my students don't know these things, and the more you hear them and the more we go over them, the more they start to sink in about what you're trying to do, what you're not trying to do, when the center's flexible, when it's not, when you need a break move, when you're not, when you should gain space, when you shouldn't, when you should follow the principle, move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. A lot of my students have been putting off castling lately. I keep telling them I must be a bad coach. Castle, 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 castle. Castle early and often is the famous funny saying, but it's not really that funny because so many of my students, like the one in the French game I showed you earlier, got into trouble by delaying castling. Generally, castling is the most important move in every opening. If you're not thinking about castling in an opening and you're not really worried about your kings going, then you're probably going to get into trouble if your opponent castles and you're not ready to castle. So anybody who says, I took lessons from Dan and he never told me how important castling is, it's like, oh, I don't have that much hair to pull out, but oh my goodness, castling. I want all my students to know if they can castle, 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 castle. Are there some exceptions to that? There's exceptions to everything. It's just a strong principle, but it can lose you the game if you put off castling too much. You really want to castle early. These are the kind of basic things in the opening principles, opening ideas, opening patterns. You want to know these as best you can. All right, thanks for watching the video. Please tell your friends about my channel. Our goal is to get to 5,000 subscribers. We're less than 100 away, so if you can tell someone, get a subscriber, that's great. If you haven't subscribed, great. Tell your friends about it. You can like the video. We'll see you next time. Bye.